All right, I think we can start, right? Great. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Bakhair hatan, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Haidar Khezri, and I'm an assistant professor at the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Central Florida in Orlando. I'm also affiliated faculty member of UCF's Kurdish Political Studies program. The Kurdish Political Studies program, hosted by the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs, is the only academic program dedicated to the study of politics of Kurds and Kurdistan in the United States. It is also the home of the Jalal Talabani Endowed Chair of Kurdish Political Studies, the only such position in the country. Since my appointment at UCF in August 2019, along with my colleagues from Department of History, Modern Languages, and Political Science, we have been expanding and developing our Kurdish program. Just this past week, UCF's Modern Languages and Literatures approved including Kurdish language courses to its curriculum. UCF will become the second university in the United States to offer Kurdish language courses regularly, starting from 2020-2021 academic year. We are also currently working on a certificate in Kurdish studies, and today's webinar also is part of this new perspective of our program. As you may know, Kurdish studies is a relatively new discipline, and for much of its existence, the field of Kurdish studies has been shaped by political and nationalist agendas, with Kurdish questions and related issues of Kurdish identity tending to dominate the field. This has left a little room for Kurdish literature and culture. That's why we devoted this webinar today exclusively on Kurdish literature and culture. Also, as you may know, research in Kurdish studies has also tended to focus on Kurds of Iraq, Turkey, and most recently, the Kurds in Syria. While the Kurdish question and community in Iran has received much less attention, to recognize and address this blind spot in Kurdish studies, we will have another webinar on October 16, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. My colleague, Dr. Kamal Soleimani, will give a talk on the political economy of Kolbari, or cross-border labor in Eastern Iranian Kurdistan. Before proceeding, I would like to review some logistics of the webinar. I think all participants have been placed in listen-only mode, and this presentation is being recorded for future broadcastings. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the box. I or one of my colleagues will bring them up at the end of the webinar. You can also ask your questions directly at the end of the webinar. Without further ado, I would like to introduce today's two distinguished speakers. Dr. Wendelmoet Hamelink is going to be our first speaker. Dr. Hamelink is a research fellow at the Social and Cultural Planning Office and at the Center for Gender Research of Oslo University. She has an MA and PhD in Cultural Anthropology and Development Sociology from Leiden University in the Netherlands. Her book, The Song Home, Narrative Morality and the Kurdish Nation, published by Brill in 2016, investigates the lyrics, life stories, and live performances of Kurdish singers that offer fascinating insight into cultural practices, local politics, and everyday life in borderlands. She has long-term fieldwork experience in many countries in the Middle East, Europe, and Africa, and she speaks Kurdish and Turkish. Her current work includes research on cultural memories and histories of Armenians originating in Eastern Turkey, and on cultural resources and resilience of refugees living in Europe. Her research project Images in Exile focuses on gender and representations among Kurdish women who recently fled Syria and live now in Scandinavia. Dr. Hamelink will talk about music, migration and conflict, Kurdish women's memories in narratives and song. Our second speaker is going to be Dr. Farangis Ghaderi. Dr. Ghaderi is a research fellow at the Center for Kurdish Studies at the University of Exeter. She obtained her PhD in Kurdish Studies from the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies of the University of Exeter in 2016, and her doctoral research examined the emergence and development of modern Kurdish poetry. She's the author of several peer-reviewed articles on Kurdish literature and co-editor of Kurdish language academic journal, Darwaza. Dr. Ghaderi will talk about the poetic of change, the emergence and development of modern Kurdish poetry. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Dr. Hamelink. Dr. Hamelink, you have 25 minutes. Karamka.
Thank you all. It's very nice to be here. I remember the first time years ago that I did an online presentation and I felt horrible. And it has changed that we really feel some connection. At least that's how it is for me. So I would like to share screen, but it says that I can't. Is there something to change about that? I don't hear you because you are still muted.
I think you can now try to share it.
Okay. Okay, great. Yes, perfect. So yes, today, thank you very much. It's just great to be here and to be in this meeting and to get to know more about the program at the university. So today I will talk about Kurdish oral tradition of Denkbeş. Denkbeş means master of the voice, and they can be both male as well as female performers. And I will look at female performers and what this tradition meant to them in a life in which they moved from one place to another and were always fleeing from conflict. So when I started my research in 2006, Kurdish studies was still a very small field, and most research focused on conflict. But of course, Kurdish society was much more than only conflict. And although the conflict is very important, it is also possible to start from a very different perspective and look through a different lens than only through the lens of conflict. Where I want to reach with this presentation is that people who live through conflict are not necessarily defined by it. Also in later projects, I continue to be interested in this question. What are the everyday life experiences of people living in conflict areas and escaping from conflict, and what is important to them? I will start with a few words on the book I wrote following on my PhD research, because it gives some clues about the topic of Kurdish women's memories and songs, and to understand the larger perspective. So the title of the book is The Song Home, and it refers to home in different ways. At the moment, at the time of my field research, which was in 2007 and 2008, there was this new phenomenon of Denkbeş houses in Turkish Kurdistan, where Denkbeş got a new platform to perform after a very long period in which they had been not very visible. Then, of course, the home also refers to the importance of language and culture as a home for the nation, to the long-term political goals of creating a Kurdish homeland. And what I focus more on in this presentation is how in conflict and migration, songs and stories can also function as a home. So in the book, I just give you a short outline of the book, which is, I have written it in 3 parts. I started with a part about songs and performance. So the first chapter is about the songs analysis of many, like a song database that I collected in that time. And the second chapter is about performances in the Dengbesh house, performing tradition, in which I argue that the Dengbesh were performing tradition, whereas the activists who were giving them a platform were hoping that they would perform the nation. Then in part 2, I investigated the life stories of Dengbesh, and I gave 7 like detailed life stories of 7 different people. In which each of them talks in different ways about the way they have been silenced, either by political pressure or because of other reasons. And then in the third part, I talk about conflict and activism. And the first chapter there is about cultural activism, in which I looked at the way the Dengbesh got a new platform and got new institutions where they could perform. And in the last chapter, which is today's paper, I talk about the story of a family on the run and the musical memories they brought with them from place to place. So I looked, I used for the book the framework of narrative and morality. And I did that because the Dengbesh were standing at a crossroads at that moment, where different storylines met. So I look at the particular historical moment of that time that I was in Turkish Kurdistan in 2007 and 2008. So there are songs and stories about village life, tribal conflict, conflict with the Ottoman and Turkish state, met, for example, with their life stories, in which they talked about the deep transformations in Kurdish society, the destruction of village life, urbanization, and new opportunities for Dengbesh. And these songs and life stories met also with the narratives of political activists who saw the Dengbesh as guardians of Kurdish heritage, but also as representatives of a new Kurdish political order, in which Kurds had to work together to reach their political goals. And in this process, at that moment, new institutions were created because there was more space in Turkey at that time for Kurdish cultural production. It was like increasingly opening up, although still under great difficulties. And people were redefining the meaning of the old traditions. So Dengbesh had earlier mostly performed in a village context, and now they performed in the new Dengbesh houses at cultural festivals and on TV. So that was a very big change. And I used the idea of morality because of the way, morality came up in the stories of the Dengbesh. They spoke in a moral way about about their art, why they were singing, how important it was, but also because of the negotiation between the Dengbesh and the new ideas of political activists who had like also moral ideas about what Kurdish culture meant and what the place of the Dengbesh should be in this. So this is, here you see some pictures in the middle of the Dengbesh house in Diyarbakir and Dengbesh performing at the festival, and on the right, the Dengbesh singing, performing on television. And in this process, women also got a new place. The political movement aimed at changing women's positions and making them forerunners and leaders together with men. So these were all new developments that had slowly received more support in Kurdish society, but were still also contested. So this is the context in which I am speaking. I will shortly let you listen to two very short fragments of songs so that you can get an idea what I'm talking about. New share, and that should be here, I think. So I will first let you listen to it. The first example is Denkbeş Gazin, who unfortunately has passed away this year, which was extremely regrettable.
أقولت تجبرية ده حجم سود ده عين لي مضاليات تشاب في أشياء ده عالباشر داتنا بنسياء بلورات كما بهبية دمك تقولوي تناور السردين بها قياء.
And then the other example.
If you manage a team, you have to
Sorry
try
for that.
Monday.com. Monday.com is the platform to track every.
Okay, so that was the technique has not abandoned us, which is good. So yeah, in the first example, you saw Denkbeş Gazin, who was singing a klam. So a klam is a recital song in which someone is telling a story. It's not in the same way rhythmic as the second example. So a klam is a solo performance which someone is singing alone. In the second example, you saw a song that people were singing together, in which there's also a pattern of someone singing a line and the rest of the group repeating it. And that type of song is called a stran. Now the strans are songs that can be shared by many people. It's like more collective knowledge that people can together sing and that many people know some strans. Whereas the klam is a more difficult singing style that is not known by everyone and is more like the specialized knowledge of the Denkbeş. So I just wanted to show you this so that you have an idea when I refer to these terms. Something about the methodology. I did research with one family who I met in 2006 or 7 in Germany. And for many years thereafter, I was in contact with them. And visited them many times. And the father, the mother, and the eldest daughter of the family were singers and performing also on TV. I also visited together with them the region where they come from in Turkish Kurdistan. So the map you are seeing, this is the place of their village, which is exactly on the border between Iraq and Turkey. And this here you see in Turkish written on the mountain, which you see from the village, the border is our honor. And just a few images to give you an impression of the area, which is very, very high in the mountains, 70 kilometers from Hakkari, Jelemerk, a small village. So, yeah, during this time that I was in contact, I'm actually still in contact with the family, but in the time that I was doing the research, we did we spoke about many things. I did like specific interviews in which we talked about the lives of each of them individually. And also they told me very many examples of the songs and the traditions in village life, which they had lived through. And I noticed in this whole period of time that you could see that there were like two modes of speaking. The one was the life stories, in which they spoke of their personal histories, and these stories were marked by sad memories of escape and conflict. And then there was the other mode of speaking, which were speaking about the songs, about village life, about generally what happened, what kind of traditions were happening in the village. And these were marked by positive emotions. And we were either speaking about the one or the other. There was not really, they were really like two different modes of speaking, which I will come back to later. So something about the family history. In 1984, they escaped from the village to Iraq because of the search by the police. And that is when the father of the family started a Peshmerga life. He joined the Peshmerga until 1997. And they stayed in Iraq, so that was actually very close to the village, to their own village, but across the border, until the Anfal campaign started in 1988. And then they escaped from there back to the village, but in hiding, because they were the father of the family was still looked after. And from there they escaped to Iran. Then in 1991, they came from Iran to Iraq, to Iraqi Kurdistan, and finally moved to Germany in 1997, when the conflict in Iraqi Kurdistan, inner Kurdish conflict, was taking place. And the oldest daughter of the family, Narin, came a few years later. So you can see that if the life of this young family, which they had 6 children, was extremely difficult, always going, like running in front of conflict, like away from conflict. And they have basically been in all parts of Kurdistan, apart from Syria. So I have, I did a narrative analysis of the life stories, in which I looked at the entire story, and in which we could find the overarching themes of Bahar's story was loneliness and despair. For Narin, this was fear and being continuously on the run already as a young child. And Cengiz, who emphasized more the positive aspects of living in a border region. And I will give some examples of this. So Bahar said about her life, all my life since I exist, I'm a human being. I have seen every war until 1991. Cengiz escaped and we stayed behind without owner. We were left without owner, we were hungry. It was winter, there was a lot of snow, we were in very bad trouble. We had to flee, we could not continue eating, we could not wash ourselves, we could not prepare our food because we had to run away together with the children. At that time, there was a lot of violence, nobody dared to do anything, and people could not even leave their house. Many, many times I have seen it with my own eyes. The government, the soldiers came into the house, they beat up the men. Women didn't know what to do. They brought the men to the police. They beat up the women many times and no one could do anything against it. Then Narin, who was very young when all these things started to happen, and she said, there are so many things and I do not know where to start. We were always gone. We were always gone, really. First, we were in Zeban. That's the name I gave to the village. Everything is, of course, anonymous. I was born there. After that, we were always at the borders. For example, in Iraq, in the village over there was somehow war of Kurds in Iraq with Saddam. We went back to Zeban, again to Iraq, then to Iran. We were always on the move. And I can only remember a little bit that we drove by minibus, and after that we had to walk, and then again with horses. And this was when the family fled to Iran from Turkey. But it was dark, it was in the night, it was in the mountains. You know, we went to Iran illegally, and we could hear the howls of wolves. We could even hear their howling. And you are afraid whether one of those might come, because in the past at our place, many people were eaten by wolves. And then in the story of Cengiz, the father of the family, who saw the border or more as something positive, or who emphasized that side. He said, we bought goods with a few friends and we brought it to the village. We used mules. Every mule could carry 100 to 120 kilos. We brought it to Iraq to sell. It took about 15 days every time. Yes, at night, crossing the border was at night. The other places were at daytime. There were mines, but we detonated them. 2 of our people were killed by landmines when they stepped on them on the way. And in this case, for example, he was emphasizing this positive experience, although it must have been, we I think know these stories about the border crossings, how dangerous they actually are. So only at the moment that I asked something about these dangers, he would reply, but it was not something that he would by himself focus on. And he says many times, like, the good thing of our village was that it was on the border. If it would not have been at the border, we could not have done it. Because of that, we could do such work. Because at first there was only little trade. You could sell whatever you wanted. You sold some things and returned. The trade was at night. But when it became easier, the profit was little, although it was still good. So yeah, in this, I could only give a few examples, but it's just to give you an idea about how each of them talked about this life in conflict on the border, in this border area, and what they emphasized. Then we go to like the second storyline in which each of them talked about the music in the village and the traditions. And they said there were different songs for many activities in daily life, songs for entertainment, for weddings and celebrations, and specialized singers, the dengbesh, and also a very large body of generally known songs that everybody could sing and join in. And to give some examples, so the way of talking about these memories was general, like in this case, for example, in our region in the past, a wedding was not 1 day, it was 3 or 4 days. Day and night they played and sang. In the past it was different. The women all gathered in one house and sang together with the bride. Men celebrated the wedding together with the groom in another place and sang songs, but now they do it together. So it's like a general mode of speaking about these traditions and what used to happen. And the same here, the tasks of the women were clear. The women looked at the house, and because there was a lot of work in the village, you don't do it alone, but with 4 or 5 girls. We work together. We milk the sheep. We put the milk in a mesh in a yogurt bag and swing it to make yogurt and cheese. While doing this, we sang songs. For example, 2 women sang and 2 others repeated. Another one looked after the children. So here you see again this general mode of speaking about the village life. And this is an example of a yogurt song. And the way you see at the right, I hope you can see, it's not covered by the picture, but you can see it's an example of such a yogurt bag in which women were swinging this bag back and forth while singing the song. And just I will get back later to this like bodily movement. And this is also an example about songs for the wedding. They sang about how the girl is now leaving and has to say goodbye, and then everyone cries. For example, this song, when the bride takes a bath, they hang a cover so that she cannot be seen. And then the women sing these lines. I sang with them, and at that moment I had to cry as well, because that moment of leaving is really sad. And this is the song that she then gave as an example, the daughter. Yeah, so I will not go too much into detail. So what I wanted to show is that the songs do a certain work. So the two storylines, they point to different coping strategies. The one is about the life story in which the sad memories come up. But when we talked about the songs and village life, then another mode of speaking came up, which was much more cheerful and happy, and which brought up also happy memories. And the songs are repetitive and widely known, and they remind of daily activities in the village, which are kind of general. And they also provoke a bodily memory because of the movements, the movements that were accompanied by singing these songs. So there was not an immediate connection to specific memories. And therefore, I saw it as an anchor in their lives, which were marked by loss and fragmentation. And in the time that that I was visiting the family, they were also quite active in performing on TV, making a CD, and making archive of their songs, which was also in a time that cultural memory got new meaning and new attention. So then I come to the conclusion. The songs about yogurt making, milking the sheep, other work songs, and wedding songs, they all remind one of the many activities that characterized village life. These activities were repetitive acts that occurred daily, weekly, or during specific months of the year. Precisely because these songs refer to repetitive, general acts that were carried out by all people in the village, they do not connect directly to individual memories. They overlook painful memories while connecting to village life and activities in their most general form. For this family, the songs and stories that they know and the way they sang these songs for a large audience on TV and CD seem to make a difference in coping with the many hardships they lived through. The act of performing songs and working on archiving them help them to piece together shattered experiences of lives fragmented by loss, violence, and departure. When singing songs and remembering them, joyful memories came up, a new sense of agency emerged, and working with the songs gave a new sense of worth. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing.
All right, Galik's Pass, Dr. Hamelink, and now we will turn the time over to Dr. Ghaderi, and Dr. Ghaderi will talk about the poetics of change, the emergence and development of modern Kurdish poetry. Mamustafarmu.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Khezri, and for organizing this panel and inviting me. It is a pleasure to be with you, and hello, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. My talk is about modern Kurdish poetry, and I will talk about the context of its emergence and its early development. And I would illustrate my points. I like to illustrate the points with reciting some samples, poetry, just to make them more vivid. I like to start with telling you an anecdote. In 1928, a young Kurdish poet from Kirkuk, that is a city in Iraqi Kurdistan now, Abdul Khaliq Sheikh Hosseini Naqshbandi, who was known as Asiri, he traveled to Istanbul. And during his visit to Istanbul, he, in his own words, he was struck by the sight of modern buildings and factories and European technologies. When he returned home, he famously set his poetry collections of over 4,000 couplets on fire. So he destroyed his poetry collection because he thought what he had written up to that point, that were mostly classical lyrics, were irrelevant. And he later wrote, خلقي خوراوا بزانی چی ازانن ور ابی گشتی شار و کارخانه و کردیانکی سر ابی سیری ویرانو کلاوی خاکی کردستان بکی تیدگی حالی گلد انجا لداخا مر ابی. Knowing what Europeans have discovered will leave you stunned. Wandering through the cities, factories, and seeing the discoveries will leave you numb. Comparing them with the ruined state of Kurdistan will leave you distraught, fraught with grief. So Asiri, after this visit, not only destroyed his poetry collection, his divan, but he took a break from writing poetry. He says that he, in his own words, he lost desire to write poetry, and for a while grappled with the idea whether it is relevant, whether poetry writing in its entirety is relevant. And he became a sworn enemy of the lovers of the hair and beloved. But conscious of the persuasive power of poetry as an established medium of expression, he eventually returned back to poetry. He resumed writing poetry, but a different poetry, and as he said, what a poetry that was relevant to the age. So this desire, or rather urge to be relevant to the age, that introduced and Asiri was not the only poet going through this dilemma. But this desire to be relevant to the age really introduced a series of fundamental changes in the perception and the function of poetry that formed the basis of Kurdish poetic modernization. Contrary to the long-held belief in the traditional Kurdish criticism that has explained the emergence of modern poetry as a radical break with the past in the 1930s and the 1940s under the leadership of Abdullah Goran, who is often called or considered as the father of modern Kurdish poetry, and as a result of familiarity with European literature. So this is the belief held in, long held in the traditional Kurdish criticism. I contend that poetic modernization was a complex and a gradual process that unfolded over the works of generations of poets. So not a particular poet, single poet, but generations of poets. And as a process, it actually emerged much earlier than the first decades of the 20th century. It started in the late 19th century and in the context of significant social and political changes in the late Ottoman Empire. And I believe it was an aesthetic response to the advent of modernity and its socio-political implications, such as nationalism in the Kurdish society. Therefore, basically argue that the motivations for change, the motivations for the poetic change were primarily social and political. So modernity and nationalism as the dominant discourse of the time were the driving sources, the driving forces of the change that resulted in the introduction of new perspectives and new rhetoric, and subsequently gradual but significant changes in themes, motives, diction, and rhetorical devices. So the process started in the late 19th century, and not in Kurdistan. It started in Istanbul, and Istanbul was a place that at the time intellectuals from different ethnicities and nationalities, ethnicities and religious backgrounds were coming together, were exchanging ideas. So Kurdish poets were excited and inspired by the technological advancements of Europe, and either they witnessed them directly through their travels, or they have heard or read about these discoveries. So the first Kurdish newspaper was published in 1898. So in the absence of Kurdish newspaper, really in the absence of prose, because Kurdish prose is a latecomer. So in the absence of prose, in the absence of Kurdish newspaper, it was poetry that updated Kurdish people about the latest scientific discoveries and the technological advancements of Europe. And obviously this was a new function for poetry. And immediately it opened the poetic system to non-literary words. So words such as telegraph, electricity, train. These are words that were first introduced into Kurdish language through poetry, and this is really significant. But as well as reflecting, so when reflecting on the manifestations of modernity, Kurdish poets, so comparison was inevitable. So Kurdish poets often compared the perceived advances of Europe with the state of their homeland, which obviously was a new source of anxiety and fear and apprehension, as it was illustrated in the ghazal that I cited by Asiri. There was a growing sense of lagging behind. There was a growing sense that while all other nations are moving forward, are striving forward, Kurds are falling behind. And again, in the absence of paper and in the absence of prose, it was poetry was the space to discuss these questions, to look for the causes, the roots. Why is that? And more often than not, traditional madrasa and religious authorities were blamed as the reason for this perceived lagging behind. As well as the advance of new lexica, new vocabularies that reflected the introduction of new industry in the empire, we had some existing concepts and words in the Kurdish language, in the poetry, that were assigned with new ideological overtones. For instance, concepts, really pivotal concepts such as millet, dawlat, vatan, they already existed in Kurdish language and in poetry. But we noticed that from the late 19th century, the signification changes. So they're assigned with new signification that echoed the emergence of the nationalistic discourse. Just to give you an example, a dawlat in classical poetry, dawlat meant wealth and kingship. Whereas when Haji Ghaderi Khoi, for instance, one of the leading voices, one of the most significant voices of Kurdish modernity, poetic modernity, uses it, he uses it as a reference to the modern state. And this really precedes the debates that we see later in the prose. But advocating national rights was a new subject, for poetry, and obviously brought along new themes and motives. Kurdish poets began to aim to infuse a sense of pride in Kurdishness. So we see that an entire ghazal, an entire qasida was devoted to the romanticization of Kurdish people. So Kurds were romanticized for their bravery, for their generosity, for their chivalry. There are many examples, but I really like this example of Haji Ghaderi Koi, who famously said, "Legawanu shwani kurdakan yek, basa bo lashkari satka radulak." Of Kurdish cowboys and shepherds, one suffices an army of hundreds of thousands. So not trained soldiers, but cowboys and shepherds were enough. One Kurdish cowboys was enough for an army of hundreds of thousands. Poetry really played a key role, a central role in the construction or reconstruction of a Kurdish construction, I think we can say, of a Kurdish national memory by creating or recreating a heroic past. So infusing its sense nostalgia for a lost golden days, for a time that Kurds were free and independent. And these were usual references to the semi-autonomous Kurdish principalities. Again, one significant change that we see in the late 19th century is a very important, significant shift in attitude toward Kurdish language. So Kurdish language was used as a medium of poetic expression for at least 4 centuries, since the 16th century, the different dialects of Kurdish. But there was always this sense that it was not as eloquent as, say, Persian or Arabic. And classical poets, so it was not the main medium of expression. It was used along with Persian and Arabic and Turkish, later Turkish. But classical poets often felt a need to explain why they are writing in Kurdish, as if they're doing something unusual, and to prove that it's not out of their inability to write in other languages. They were writing, they're producing in other languages. But we noticed that from the late 19th century, and specifically with the poetry of Haji Ghaderi Koi, this changes. So the tone from I call it an apologetic tone, changes to one that claims that so the question from why in Kurdish becomes why not in Kurdish. And so Kurdish intellectuals were scorned for neglecting their language. They were urged to write and cultivate their language, and those who didn't were actually scorned. Again, there's a famous ghazal by Haji Ghader, which says, "Yekser ulama," he lamented, "Yekser ulama durushtu burdi nakhwen nawa du harfi kurdi. Ustadi khatan la amsiyana, waqti la zubani khoy nazana." All are educated, young and old, do not read Kurdish. All are the masters of these 3. So he doesn't even bring himself up to mention the names of the 3, which we know were Persian, Arabic, and Turkish. So he says, all are the masters of the 3. When it comes to Kurdish, they're illiterate. So what is interesting, when we compare it to the classical, the poetic production in the late 19th century to the classical poetry, is that we notice transformation of poetry from a private to a public phenomena. So while, for instance, classical ghazal and qasida were understood to be expressions of private emotions, personal experiences, we noticed that from the late 19th century, they were used, ghazal and qasida were used to as sites of collective and public reflection, as well as a new means of enlightenment. So by the early decades of the 20th century, a new definition of poetry was in place, and poets were assigned with a new responsibility. And this responsibility was awakening the people, because, and it's fascinating, reading the poetry, and from the early, was the start of Kurdish journalism. We read that Kurdish society was repeatedly depicted, portrayed as a sleeping nation. So a nation that has lost consciousness, behosh. So has lost consciousness, is deep in sleep. And so it was, and this is while all other nations were awake and striving and thriving. So it was became the responsibility of the poet to wake his nation, to wake their nation from this sleep of ignorance, and rouse them and bring them back to life. And again, this was a new expectation from poets. Ignorance was deemed as the reason, or really the main reason for all the sufferings of the Kurds, all the ills in the society, and education, modern education, the only cure. If we have time, I would like to recite opening line of a ghazal by another significant voice in the poetic modernization, Abdurrahim Rahmi Hakkari, who is known in Turkey as Zapsu more than Hakkari, who was a Kurdish nationalist poet, but also a very significant religious Islamic scholar. He published this ghazal in Jin, which was a periodical published between 1918 to 1919. This particular ghazal was published in 1919, and it starts, Ey jahlu nazanin, tui dujmen, tui kha'in, zulmate helan, hami be san'atu bedin, qahrate veran kiriya, ah wa tanemen, kinate belane kiri, jismu tanemen, serwat tajamestandiya be malu deravi, amma in belengazu faqir, khana balavi. Oh, ignorance, ignorance, you are the enemy, you are the traitor. It's your tyranny that has left us bereft of skill and faith. It's your cruelty that has ruined my homeland. It's your hatred that has deprived me of a refuge. You have taken our wealth. You have left us homeless and penniless. What is really striking is, you see, that the prospect, and it was very powerful, the prospect of losing one's not just skill, but faith, losing your faith as a result of a lack of knowledge. It was a very powerful way of arguing, especially coming from a religious authority and an Islamic scholar. And it's really interesting that how from a personal suffering, it moves on the poem that to the national level, that not only this is the reason I am deprived of a refuge, it's the entire nation without wealth, as we are a homeless nation because of the lack of knowledge. So you see that how the function or the expectation of poetry changed. And obviously an immediate consequence of employing poetry as a medium of enlightenment, as a pedagogical tool, was the adoption of a simpler language. It was just inevitable that a simpler language, and in particular in comparison with the classical poetry, where language was highly embellished and complex. When sometimes reading classical poetry, it's like solving a riddle. It's like solving a puzzle. It's so complex. Whereas we notice this here, the meaning is direct, it's not hidden. And it's really important to note that although drawing on almost entirely new subjects and themes, the traditional and familiar poetic forms such as ghazal and qasida were adopted for these new purposes. And they were adopted and adapted by the Kurdish, very successfully by the Kurdish poets. But so up to the 1930s, Kurdish poets had successfully used the tools that they had, the convention, the classical traditional conventions that they had. But from the 1930s, we note that classical poetic system and its conventions, and specifically its hyperbolic language, began to be branded as unnatural and began to be ridiculed even. Famously, Peter Mert, who is one of the leading modernist poets, wrote in his short autobiography that, I quote, "I am ashamed of some of my older poems, replete with exaggeration and bombast. There were popular metaphors in the past, but reading them now makes you cringe with embarrassment." And then he elaborated on by citing examples of such metaphors of embarrassment, source of embarrassment, by saying that classical poets, for instance, have compared the delicate hair of the beloved to black snakes, her eyelashes to spears, her figure to a cedar tree. What effects will visualizing the beauty of the beloved using dangerous animals leave on one's soul? And it's really fascinating, this sense of this feeling of this embarrassment, the feeling of shame concerning the hyperbolic language of the classical poetry that was the norm for hundreds of years. So this is a new phenomenon, but also really marked a turning point in the development of modern poetry. So poets like Peter Mert propose a new model to emulate. Previously, the source of inspiration were Persian poetry and then Arabic poetry and Turkish poetry. But he proposed a new model that was a European poetry. And so Europe previously was a source of inspiration for technological, scientific advancements, discoveries. But now it started to become a source of inspiration for culture and literature as well. However, really reading these references to Europe and European literature, when we study them, it becomes apparent that understanding or the perception of this European literature was to a large extent indirect, well, through translation, but sketchy and even somewhat imaginary. For instance, Peter Mert elaborates in a conversation with another poet, Farangis. He said, European poets have turned away from using exaggeration and fantasies. They write factually and materially. مادي وحقيقي دنوسن. They write factually and materially. So, I mean, we can talk a lot about, you know, what are these European, who are these European poets who are writing factually and materially? But there was a sense that Europe is so the advancement of Europe must have something to do with the culture and literature. So that's the way to go forward, to emulate them. In fact, again, from the 30s and the 40s, we see that, again, this question that the poetry, writing poetry in its entirety became, was questioned and was deemed a futile job. Peter Mert, very interestingly, even described writing poetry as the profession of liars. However, ironically, he's one of the most prolific Kurdish poets. And he wrote and published poetry his entire life. So he never stopped writing poetry, despite calling it a profession of liars. And that is because he recognized the power of poetry for socio-political purposes. For him, poetry was a powerful force of change. And he wrote somewhere that poetry turns imagination, I quote, poetry turns imagination into thought and thought into action. And it was this power that he harnessed, or he wanted to harness. From the 1930s, so far the changes, transformation were mostly in the content, in the theme, motives, diction. But from the 1930s, we see more noticeable transformation in form, and notably the adoption of syllabic meter instead of the conventional and classical Aruzi meter. So Aruzi meter was a meter taken from the Arabic and Persian poetry and was practiced for hundreds of years by Kurdish poets. But they began to, modernist poets began to see Aruzi poet as foreign, as foreign and inauthentic, and started to adopt syllabic meter. And it's very interesting. This was really largely inspired by the modern Turkish poetry, and especially the 5 syllabist poets, Beşheceler poets. But something else that happened at this time in 1930 was that there was a consciousness or a trend of collecting and publishing folklore, Kurdish folklore. And syllabic meter is the meter that is used in Kurdish folklore. So the Kurdish poets began to see syllabic meter that was inspired by the modern Turkish poetry, really. They began to see it as the authentic, as the national meter, as one true to the nature of the Kurds, as one poet called it. And it was all this talk about European poetry. It was really from the late 40s and 50s onward that we see more translations of English and French poetry into Kurdish, and they inspired Kurdish poets significantly for more specifically for experimentation with rhyme and form. I will conclude. So as conclusion, I would like to reiterate that so modern Kurdish poetry emerged in response to the advent of modernity and nationalism in Kurdish society. The emergence of modern Kurdish poetry was a gradual process. It was a gradual process of change in which the traditional forms were adapted to the conditions of modernity. So modernity did not diminish the status of poetry, but in fact, it reinforced it as a powerful means of enlightenment and resistance. Modern poetry was also the literary form that accompanied the emergence of Kurdish nationalism. The formation of the imagined community of Kurds couldn't rely on print media because of the higher rate of illiteracy, and the Kurdish newspapers' limited circulation, as well as the economic and the political difficulties of printing in Kurdish. It was, in fact, poetry that provided this space, this discursive means of disseminating nationalism, and it made it intelligible to ordinary people, to Kurdish people. Throughout the 20th century, modern poetry has been an integral part of the Kurdish political uprising and revolutions, and has remained an effective tool in mobilizing forces and continues to be site of resistance throughout Kurdistan. Thank you very much for your patience, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
Zor spas mamastan. So we'll go ahead and take some time for questions. Please either raise your hand so I can unmute you, or just type your questions in the chat.
So good.
Probably one question from Yamin.
Suleiman, you had a question, right? So
can I talk?
Okay. Yes, please go ahead, and then we will take a question from Yamina. First, you go.
May I ask how many minutes do I have?
just ask you a question.
Yeah. First of all, thank you both of the speakers and you and the organizer. It's a great approach or beginning, because this is my first webinar I attend to these meetings. Okay, I didn't know about it. So maybe you had different lectures about the Kurds, okay, but I see a root of tree, which Dr. Ghaderi talked about, one branch about the poetry and how it came to Kurdish culture, and Dr. Sorry, the other doctor talking about songs in Kurdistan in Turkey. But I would like to talk briefly about the roots, if it's possible, or another events, if you can organize it, talking about the Kurds. Why is so much suppression of the Kurds about these songs, and the very sad songs in Turkish? When I listen to them, I feel cry, part of it. Also, the other parts is still talking about the mountains, about the Peshmerga, how they killed the children, the women, and also about the poets Dr. Ghaderi mentioned. So why this is like this? I would like to talk about it if you give me a chance for 2-3 minutes. Otherwise, we postponed it for another session. It's up to you, but I just want to read.
Suleiman, I'm sorry. So if you have any question, you can ask your questions. So because I think other people are in the line, so we just, I don't believe we have 2 or 3 minutes to kind of like, devote it to you.
Just want to correct one thing. The mashka is to make butternut yogurt, because yogurt is by boiling milk and added a culture for some yogurt. You can correct this. And about the Qadri's speech could be speaking about the woman's position, because when you look at the Kurdish culture, you see all the men's. This is very recent, since 1984 maybe, or 1979 from Iran. The woman involved in Peshmerga and involved in the society, because the women were only housekeeper. And another thing is, all these classes, maybe Khana or Goran, talks about the class. Two things is missing, okay? The class is missing, means there is no class in terms of the workers and the capitalists in the Kurdistan. All these nationalists, they ignore this.
Okay, excellent. Thank you so much. So let's go to the next person. Yemina, please go ahead on ask your question.
Hi, I have a question for Dr. Hamelink about Dembesh houses. So I was looking at the photo, and the Dembesh houses had lots of men in front of it, almost like similar to like a Middle Eastern cafe. And I was wondering if Dembesh houses are gender segregated in such a way, and if they are, how does that cause issues for women who are trying to be included in these movements?
You want me to reply immediately, Mamoste, or shall I wait for the questions?
Yeah, you can just answer her question, and then we can go. Yeah.
First, thank you also, Mr. Suleiman, for your remark about Meshk. I will notate it. And the question about the Dembesh house. So at the time, then they are not gender segregated, and there were also women visiting the houses, and this was also definitely an objective of the organizers, that there would be more women visiting these houses and performing there. But it was still not very common for women to perform like in front of men, and this was like it was like a taboo or something that was at that moment increasing. So the participation of women was increasing, but it was still a little bit little. So in the years after, I think that things have changed, and I haven't really followed much. Actually, there are others who have worked on specifically on women denkbesh and who have written more about them. So, for example, Marlene Schäfers has done a good work on women denkbesh. So, yeah, there is a lot to say about it, but the women, it was like a moment in which women slowly were getting more space for this kind of performances. Thank you.
Can I ask a question? Oh.
Yes, please go ahead. Sorry, I was mute too.
Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, Haidar, for giving me the opportunity to be part of this seminar. My name is Aslam, and I'm a PhD student, and my research is on the comparative historical analysis of the social movements of Turkish Kurds and Pakistani Pashtuns. I'm from Pakistan, and I'm very delighted to be here, and thank you to both speakers for the wonderful presentations. My question is from Dr. Ghaderi. Yeah. So you said that poetry or Kurdish poets, they have played a central role in the construction of a heroic Kurdish past and identity and national memory. And you mentioned a poet who said that one Kurdish boy is equal to 1,000, an army of 1,000 of soldiers. Coming from Pakistan, Pashtun poets have said the same thing about constructing a very brave and heroic identity of the Pashtuns. But don't you think such perspectives or narratives are very romanticized and reductionist? Or you think such construction of identity of the Kurds as brave people was necessary given the negativity of the situation with which they were faced because of the historical circumstances and the suppression that they went through? So, and how much does that kind of construction of identity help or doesn't help in improving the life and the circumstances of the Kurdish people? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you answered your question. It was, we have to take into consideration the time, the context of this poem. This was late 19th century, the rise of nationalism in the region, the nationalistic discourse, and as I mentioned, there was this sense that Kurds are falling behind, are lagging behind. Everyone is moving, everyone is striving, all other nations. And they didn't feel that the Kurdish nation, the Kurdish people have the confidence. You could say that even now, to be honest, they don't have the confidence. They didn't have the confidence that's required or demand a state of their own. So that's why they kind of reminded them of what they had. So they had this independence, or not really, but they didn't have a total independence. But So they were creating this golden past that has to be recreated. It was lost, and now it's it's time to recreate that. But I'd like to also mention that while Kurdish people were portrayed in poetry as late 19th century, early 20th century, as you know, the bravest, you know, the most generous nation on earth. At the same time, reading poetry, you see that Kurdish people are portrayed, are scorned as the most ignorant people on earth. Why? Because they have neglected their language, they have neglected their own culture. So there is this paradox of the most noble people, as well as the most ignorant for very different reasons. But it was I think we have to take them into consideration, take the context, the time into consideration.
Okay, Sarah, would you like to go ahead and read that question, and then we can go to Bilal?
Yes, so Benjamin asked a question actually. Would you mind repeating the name of the Kurdish poet that tore up his poems? I believe it was for Dr. Ghaderi. So I don't know if you want to repeat it, or you can also write it on the chat box, whatever you prefer. Thank you.
I can put it in the chat box as well. Asiri.
Thank you.
So we go to Bilal. Bilal, please go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, hello. I have a question for the Dr. Hamelink. I'm also working on the Kurdish theater in Turkey and diaspora, and I want to ask about the political economy of the Denkbeş, especially the migration from the villages to cities. They have to earn their life through their art practices or in different jobs. How they can survive in the field, and their economic conditions and their negotiation with these conditions, do those conditions affect their art practices regarding the political attitude or their political relations with the other institutions?
Thank you for your question. As far as I have been able to find out, also in the past, most Denkbeş were not living from their art. So it was something that they did on the side, or there must have been, you know, like there could have been some exceptions to that rule, but usually they would not live from it. And at the time of the research, many Denkbeş had been not very active performing because in Turkish Kurdistan, a lot of villages, as you know, thousands of villages have been destructed. There were so many migrants coming to the cities, and this whole social structure of village life in which the Denkbeş had a place was disappearing. So in that time, they had been like invited back. They had been given a new platform, let's say, like as I said, the TV, those cultural festivals, the Denkbeş houses. But this was not something that they would really earn money with, or very minor money. So most of them had a job, did either jobs in the city or lived outside of the city and were involved in farming. Yeah, so that was actually also true for that time, that I have not met any Denkbeş who could live from the performances. And this was both for men and women, yeah.
Great, thank you very much. Any other questions?
Perhaps Yamina wants to ask another question.
Okay, so Yamina, go ahead, please.
Hi, sorry. I had a question for Dr. Ghaderi about poetry related to European poetry. you mentioned that Kurdish poets kind of reveled the European structure of poetry and to some degree culture. I'm wondering if you think that it could be problematic because of long histories with European colonization in other regions. Do you think that that could pose a conflict rather than having Kurdish people revel their own poetry, if that makes sense?
So, sorry, can you, do you mind repeating your question?
So,
yeah.
So the question is, do you think that it could be problematic for Kurdish poetry to idolize European poetry, and assuming that it is better in terms of how they're structured or how they express themselves, because of previous colonial issues with European influence and other ethnic groups?
Yeah. Yeah, no, thank you very much for your question. That's a very interesting question. I didn't have time to elaborate on that. I don't see a problem. There isn't a problem with that, but well, there is. But the problem is not that not the inspiration from the European poetry, but the problem that I had was the narratives. That the narrative in traditional classical Kurdish literary criticism was that this poetic modernization came about because of the influence of the European poetry, because Kurdish poets started to read European and specifically English and French poetry. And this is how it emerged. But what I done is, what I believe is that it's much more complex. It's European literature. I think that the role and the influence of European poetry has been very much exaggerated. It was inspirational at the later stages of the poetic modernization, but at its earliest stages, as I said, the motivation were really, in my view, were not literary. The motivations were sociopolitical. And the other issue, the problem perhaps was this view, is that was viewing the influence of European literature as the ultimate motivation ground for change, is that it reinforces this very Eurocentric narrative of modernization. That modernization, there is only one narrative, and that's Western Eurocentric narrative. But we know that that has been challenged for some time, and there are different interpretation and narratives of modernity, and each of them are valid in their own sense. True, the Western modernity had the precedence, but that doesn't mean that there is only one version of modernization. And it's really important to note, that the other cultures, non-European cultures, and again, even the very notion of concept of Europe, it's problematic in itself. Which Europe, where Europe, what do you mean by Europe? But the other cultures, non-European cultures, non-Western cultures, did not copy-paste the modernization project. They had their own versions, and they saw that the process was actually very, very conscious. You see that certain aspects of modernization or certain aspects of modernity were highlighted, were selected, whereas some aspects were glossed over. For instance, in Kurdish context, almost really modernity became equivalent with modern education. So it became an equivalent of education, but we know that it's not, education was only one aspect. But this aspect was highlighted because it suited the Kurdish cause, as well as the national discourse, nationalism.
I think I don't see any other questions, but I myself have a question actually for you, Dr. Ghaderi. I think you mentioned Pierre Mert's perspective on poets being professional liars. Do you see any connection between what he said with what we have it in pre-modern Islamic culture, based on a very famous way of saying "Ahsanu shari akdhabuhu," which basically means the best poetry is the one lies the most. And actually, a lot of medieval Arabic and Persian scholars translated lie here not as a lie the way we know it, but based on imagination. And this is the way that actually when unbelievers calling Quran is a poetry, they were actually saying that Quran is based on imagination, it's not fact. So do you think, is there any connection between what Pierre Mert said and with pre-modern notion of imagination?
That's really interesting. I don't know what if Pierre Mert had that in mind, but what I can say is that really this was part of the process that stereotyped classical poetry. So stereotype in a sense that it highlighted the hyperbolic language of classical poetry, which was, so when classical poets compare the beloved hare to snakes, this was a convention that was acceptable, accepted. This was a convention, and it was practiced for hundreds of years. But what was interesting, what is interesting is that this specific aspect of classical poetry, that is its hyperbolic language, the use of exaggeration, was picked up as the very opposite of reality. And remember, the fascination was reality, was material. At this time, the fascination and even obsession was everything material. Again, the influence of the modernity and these new ideas. So with that fascination or obsession, everything that was imaginary became a source of shame, a source of embarrassment. That's why he thought that classical poets were when he says that it's a profession of liars, he specifically talks about classical poets. So they are out of touch with realities. They don't talk about the reality. So it was, I think, part of that process, stereotypical image, creating that stereotypical image of classical poetry before turning their back completely.
I have one final question. Can I ask?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yes.
Very quickly. From Dr. Wendelmoet. Can you explain the idea of Dangbash? I missed it. I didn't understand what it means. Dangbash. Thank you.
Yeah, it is an oral poet, so someone an oral performer who sings songs and tells stories in a particular way, a Kurdish oral performer. The name means Deng is voice and Beige is to say, so it's like master of the voice. And I also have another remark, because when I was listening to Farangis and then comparing with my own talk, it's kind of interesting how these are so completely separate realms. And I think it would be quite interesting to look at this from the perspective of maybe class and how this and also the connections. You know, I know that there are poets and Kurdish writers who have used oral tradition as a basis, or like have got inspiration from that. But just even when I compare our talks, and it is like so completely different from each other, and so I think it would be quite interesting to look more also at the connections. And so this is just an encouragement for anyone who would like to take this up. Thank you.
Right. So thank you, everyone. I think I appreciate you being here. Just a reminder, we have another webinar on October 16, 2020 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. My colleague, Dr. Kamal Soleimani, will give a talk on the political economy of Kolbar in Eastern or Iranian Kurdistan. Well, with that being said, thank you, everyone, and I wish you a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for organizing this.
Thank you very much
for your attendance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.